Hi, everybody. Hey, y'all. My name's Tim Little. I'm the Executive Director of the Rose Foundation for Communities and the Environment. We commissioned the report that we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to say a word about the Rose Foundation, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. And I, two years into the pandemic and Zoom, I mean, this kind of has the quality of seatbelt announcements on airplanes. But a couple of things, because we're doing it a little different today since it's a Zoom webinar. You can type anything you want to into the chat, but only the panelists are going to see it. And that's a great place to put any specific note to a panelist, or if you have a tech issue, we have somebody who can help you with that. But you're not going to be able to use the chat to pass notes to each other, and sorry about that. We would please ask you to use the chat to introduce yourself to the panelists, to drop in your name and the office you work with, because the format we're using, you can see us, but we can't see you. So if you could please just type yourself into the chat, then we all know who's here. There's going to be time at the end for questions. I absolutely guarantee it. And you'll see separate from the chat a Q&A function. That's where your questions go. Please type them in at any time during anybody's presentation, and then we'll get to those when we go to the Q&A. And we've got 90 minutes. Presentations are going to be an hour. We've reserved about a half hour for Q&A. And so let's roll. So like I said, I'm Tim Little. I'm the Executive Director of the Rose Foundation for Communities and the Environment. You know, everything that you need to know about the Rose Foundation is in our name. We work at the intersection of people and the environment. Yeah, I mean, everybody has a right to clean air and clean water. We all need a stable climate. We all need access to healthy natural areas. And equity and ethics and justice require that we support communities whose rights have been historically ignored. And then beyond people, the natural world has an intrinsic value and right to exist beyond any usefulness to us. And since nature can't speak for us, yes, we have an obligation to speak for nature. So that's what the Rose Foundation's philosophy is, and that's what all of our grant-making programs are structured around, is grassroots initiatives for healthy nature, equitable communities, corporate and governmental accountability. And we also support education and new research. And that's what gets us to the report we're talking about today. CEQA, California's living environmental law, CEQA's role in housing, environmental justice, and climate change. We commissioned the report. It was written by the Housing Workshop. When I first started working on environmental issues in California 48 years ago, one of the first things I learned about was CEQA, and that it was an absolute cornerstone, a bedrock of California environmental law and policy, because it choreographed a way that regular people who were going to be affected by proposed new projects got to ask tough questions about how the project might impact them. Regular people asking tough questions is never convenient for people in power. And so the Rose Foundation commissioned this study because we're concerned about the barrage of negative media coverage around CEQA over the last several years. And the media reports argue about the high cost of CEQA compliance, that it makes almost all development untenable, that litigation under CEQA is running rampant, that CEQA is the primary obstacle to housing construction, including all the affordable housing we need, and that CEQA has become a drag on California's economy. So we asked the authors to examine these claims, the assumptions behind them, and the evidence behind each of these arguments, because we wanted a report that was based on a thorough review of the applicable literature and empirical data obtained from objective sources. So this report we're talking about today, it builds on a 2016 report that we commissioned. That report was produced by BAE Urban Economics, and it was written by the same folks that did this one, Janet Smithheimer and Jessica Hitchcock. And the 2016 report focused on the amount of CEQA litigation, the cost of CEQA compliance, and whether CEQA negatively affected the economy of the state. And the current report looks at all that stuff again and updates it. But it also gets into two new areas. It specifically looks at the interplay between CEQA and housing. I mean, that's such a key question of our time. I mean, we all know the housing shortage. And secondly, the report assesses whether and how CEQA addresses environmental justice and climate. And I would say we at the Rose Foundation, and I would hope we would all agree, these are some of the greatest challenges of our day that we have to meet. So now I want to introduce you to the panelists. We have the two authors of the report, and then we have 3 community reviewers. Jessica Hitchcock is one of our authors. She's the president of Urban Math. It's a consulting firm that specializes in using advanced data to inform intelligent public policy. As a consultant of public agencies, she's crafted solutions to really complex problems, including major housing policy initiatives. Jessica's passion is affordable housing, and her work reflects a deep understanding of the intersections of markets, public policy, and equity. Janet Smithheimer is the other major report author. She's the founder and longtime president of BAE Urban Economics, and now the principal of the Housing Workshop. She's a nationally recognized leader in affordable housing policy, economic development, and P3. And her housing work spans 3 decades of affordable housing policy and feasibility studies for the biggest cities in the US, including San Francisco, LA, New York. She's trained in city planning and real estate development finance, and she's spoken or taught for the Urban Land Institute, American Planning Association, Association of Environmental Professionals, and a lot of other organizations. Then we also have 3 of the community members who reviewed the report for us. We have Tiffany Eng. She's a native of Oakland and an advocate and community organizer that's worked with youth and families in California for over 20 years. She serves, currently she's the interim co-director at the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and she supports their work around climate, energy, green zones, and legislative advocacy. She formerly served as CEHA's Green Zones Program Manager and supported all kinds of environmental justice work that the communities are leading now, groundbreaking work to transform polluted and neglected areas into resilient and vibrant neighborhoods. In addition to work at CEHA, she formerly worked at the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Policy Link, and the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley. We also have Aruna Prabhala. She's one of our report reviewers. She's the Urban Wildlands Director and a senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. That center's a nonprofit public interest environmental group that's dedicated to the protection of native species and their habitats through science, policy, and environmental law. And they've worked for years to protect imperiled plants and wildlife, open space, air and water quality, and you know, the overall quality of life for everybody in California and across the country. And so in her role at the center, she leads a team of scientists, campaigners, and attorneys that push for sustainable land use planning, particularly at the urban wildland interface. And Aruna's legal practice focuses on CEQA and NEPA, and the emphasis is on climate change, environmental justice, and species protection. And then finally last, and I mean, I guess, well, yeah, I want to say this because now there's a deal. Baseball season's going to happen again. Batting cleanup for us is Sean Hecht. He's the co-executive director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and the Evan Frankel Professor of Policy and Practice at UCLA School of Law. His teaching includes public natural resources law and policy, environmental law, and California state environmental law. His research includes developing legal and policy tools for building resilience to climate change impacts, including wildfire, including coastal impacts, examining the relationship between environmental justice and mainstream environmental advocacy, and understanding the role that science plays in environmental policy making. Sean's a frequent speaker, media commentator on a whole wide range of issues, and he collaborates on projects with practicing environmental lawyers, environmental and community justice advocacy organizations, policymakers, and the business community. So I'm now gonna turn it over to our panel. They're each gonna speak, and then we have a Q&A session afterwards. And I guarantee we're going to leave time for the Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function at any time. And you know, again, that's not the same as the chat. If you put a question in the chat, we'll probably find it, but the right place is the Q&A. And now let's pass it over to one of the report's authors, Jessica Hitchcock.
Thank you, Tim. Can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great, thank you. It's just it's embarrassing when you start speaking and someone tells you you're still on mute. So my name is Jessica Hitchcock, and I am one of the co-authors of this report, along with Janet Smithheimer from the Housing Workshop. And we're really excited to be on this panel today that Tim has assembled to report on the key findings. This is a great panel, and hopefully you'll walk away with a more expansive view of the importance of CEQA in California. So I'm gonna go through the agenda. So today we are going to talk about CEQA's process, and then discuss a summary of CEQA lawsuits, talk about CEQA and housing production, the cost of CEQA compliance. Janet will talk about CEQA's effect on California prosperity and sustainability. Then Tiffany will talk about CEQA and environmental justice. Aruna will discuss CEQA and climate change, and Sean Hecht will provide some closing remarks. So before I launch into these study questions, I just want to acknowledge that, the Housing Workshop took on this study because there was a real gap in the empirical data and, fact-based analysis about how CEQA applies to projects. As Tim alluded to, in recent years, we've seen a lot of reports with misleading statements circulating in the press and elsewhere. And critics have claimed that CEQA compliance is hindering development, that litigation is rampant, that CEQA is a primary obstacle to building housing, including much needed affordable housing. So to address these common critiques, we try to answer these following questions. First, how frequent is CEQA litigation? How does CEQA affect housing production in California? What are the direct costs of CEQA compliance? Has CEQA constrained the state's economic prosperity or its ability to develop sustainably? And is CEQA an effective tool in combating the problems of environmental justice and climate change? In terms of the methodology, this study was very data-driven and evidence-based to the extent possible. We relied on three primary methods. The first is a literature study of existing empirical studies. The second is we conducted primary research and quantitative analysis on a number of topics, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And we also relied on case studies as well. So before we dive in, let's take a moment to talk about how CEQA works. I think everyone in this room really does know how CEQA works, but just as a quick summary, CEQA was passed in 1970. And the purpose was to really foster transparency in public decision-making while making sure that land use decisions considered the full impacts of development on the environment. So I could walk you through this flow chart. That could probably warrant a seminar unto itself, but I think, let me just highlight a few key points. The first is CEQA requires a process for environmental review. So that means that projects are studied, potential impacts are evaluated, ways to mitigate or reduce significant impacts are identified. There's opportunity for public comment and disclosure to the public why decisions are made, even if significant impacts occur. So I like to refer to this as daylighting, right? It's, you're shining a light on the potential impacts so that decision makers can be more informed about the decisions that they're making. Environmental review is a process, but it's not an approval or a disapproval mechanism. Oftentimes, because mitigation measures or there are changes to the scope, this process often results in better projects. And I think the last thing to note is that CEQA is a living law. So in recent years, the legislature has passed a number of ways to streamline CEQA to advance priorities like infill and affordable housing, wildfire prevention, to name a few examples. And CEQA has an adaptable framework that can adjust to the current environmental challenges while still maintaining its overall review objectives. So let's dig into the data a little bit. I think CEQA lawsuits are really at the forefront of everyone's minds, especially with the UC Berkeley case. So let's for a moment set that case aside and let's take a more comprehensive look at this issue. If I could direct your attention to that black line, that covers the number of CEQA lawsuits between 2002 to 2019. As you can see, the number of CEQA lawsuits has remained fairly stable in these years. Between 2002 and 2019, on average, there were 195 CEQA lawsuits filed annually. And while the number has fluctuated somewhat, there's no discernible trend of increasing litigation, which is notable because, in that same time period, California's population increased about 15%, but the annual number of CEQA lawsuits has remained, pretty flat. We also wanted to understand how these lawsuits compare to the universe of projects reviewed under CEQA. So essentially, what is the true CEQA litigation rate? And this is tricky because to do this right, you have to calculate the denominator, which is the universe of CEQA projects with review documents. The report talks more about this methodology, but essentially we took data published by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which compiles data on CEQA activities submitted to the state clearinghouse. But because not all projects are submitted to the state clearinghouse, we had to figure out OPR's capture rate. So we found sample cities, we called them and asked them for their true data. What is the number of CEQA review documents that they actually completed, compared this to the OPR data and backed into CEQAnet's capture rate, which we were then used to calculate the total CEQA projects with review documents. Yeah, it was, extensive, but more importantly, what we found was that between 2013 and 2019, the estimated rate of litigation was just 2% for the 7-year period between 2013 and 2019. The rate is low and consistent with other findings from other studies. So including, there was a 2017 Senate Environmental Quality Committee report that looked at the litigation rate for projects undergoing CEQA review by state agencies. And that report found a litigation rate of about 1%. So this is, within that range. Moving on, let's examine CEQA and housing production. So this graph shows a time series of annual housing production from 1960 to 2020. It covers a 60-year period. And I think what you'll see is really the cyclical nature of housing production in California. You see periods of growth followed by recession and then recovery. Even though CEQA was passed in 1970 and applied to private development starting in 1972, California's production still continued, reaching a peak. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in 1986, when the state built over 300,000 units of housing that year. What's interesting is that in the last 2 cycles, California hasn't been able to reach those production levels again. And I think what's important to note is that there are many factors at play. The causes of California's housing crisis are really complicated and multifaceted. I'm going to turn to this. Last week, the state published the statewide housing plan. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's very good. And it pointed to several factors contributing to the lack of housing production. This includes historical patterns of housing segregation and exclusion, insufficient land zoned for housing, high costs, both for land and construction, lack of funding, especially for affordable housing, neighborhood opposition, and the last one, regulatory hurdles. I want to point out on the last point, in 2018, UC Berkeley Center for the Law, Energy, and the Environment, they published a really great study. It was a series of in-depth case studies that tracked project entitlements and CEQA review processes. So entitlements and CEQA review for, it was like 800,000 units in multiple cities across the state, both in Northern and Southern California. And that report found that most of the delay and obstacles were driven by discretionary review of land use entitlements, rezonings, design review. and that CEQA review was not a primary obstacle to project approvals. I think we can all understand the gravity of the state's housing crisis. And with that, I know the California legislature has amended CEQA and enacted measures to streamline housing production. But beyond anecdotal stories, there's really no empirical evidence and research on how frequently these streamlining options have been used. So we contacted a few cities representing different parts of the state, including San Francisco, an urban city, Santa Barbara County, which is coastal and it has pockets of rural and urban areas, and Truckee, a mountain town nestled near Lake Tahoe. And we begged them for data. We want to know, how did your multifamily housing projects go through CEQA? And they gave us the data, which is great. So what's striking, as you'll see, and I'll go through those, is that each of these communities is different in how they process CEQA projects. They use different tools. Some are still on the learning curve, but I think you'll see that the existing exemptions are being used. So let's start with San Francisco first. So San Francisco uses a lot of the tools. We asked how multifamily housing projects were reviewed under CEQA between 2018 and 2020. And San Francisco reviewed 120 projects, totaling about 8,000 units. And just 7 of those projects required full EIRs. And those are generally larger projects with significant impacts. I think interestingly, I want to point your direction to this, I don't know if you can see, to the community and specific plan category. So the largest segment of projects tiered off program EIRs for community and specific plans. So what we found interesting in talking to city staff is that San Francisco's historic growth fueled the need to plan comprehensively because residents were really concerned about how that growth was affecting their neighborhood. So in the past decade and a half, San Francisco's completed multiple specific plans with program EIRs with mitigation measures from which subsequent projects can tier off existing environmental documents. Between 2018 and 2020, there were 27 projects representing about 2,500 units that utilize this tiering mechanism. Another category, okay, so developers in San Francisco are also invoking SB 35, so particularly for affordable housing projects. So the city processed 15 applications since the law became effective in 2018. And strikingly, affordable housing accounted for 92% of the total units created by SB 35, which is significant. The infill exemption is also working too, 50 projects. That's about 40% of the total multifamily projects, representing about 1,500 units. So, they're smaller projects, 30 units per project. They're using the infill exemption. And there was one project that used AB 83, the homeless housing exemption during COVID. So I think that this is a great example of a city that proactively plans for growth with community input. Staff are conversant with how to use these exemptions, and you can see CEQA working. It's not an impediment to production. In fact, the city staff believe that development can happen in tandem with environmental protections. Now let's move to Santa Barbara and Truckee. So Santa Barbara County comparatively has fewer multifamily housing projects, just 3 between 2018 and 2020. And what's interesting there is developers are also invoking SB 35 and AB 2162. In Truckee, they're using different tools, it looks like, for CEQA review. They use the infill exemption, the common sense exemption, where applicable. EIRs still constitute a high proportion of review, but it's probably because these projects had significant impacts. More importantly, when we talked to Truckee, though, the takeaway there when we interviewed them was that they're facing housing production challenges unrelated to CEQA. They have challenges related to infrastructure, insufficient public transit, wildfire evacuation routes, for example. These are the issues that are affecting housing production there. And, CEQA was not a constraint. So let's pull back, right? So we're coming from the case studies. Let's take a look at everything from the state level again, and see how SB 35 specifically is working. So as you may know, SB 35 was enacted in 2018 to streamline the approval of eligible multifamily projects. Projects can be considered for ministerial approval as long as they meet certain criteria. You still have to do a tribal consultation, for example. And it's really applicable to when jurisdictions don't meet their fair share of their RHNA production. Between 2018 and 2020, you'll see a steady rise in the number of projects using SB 35 from 32 in 2018 to 49 in 2020. I wish I had time to pull the 2021 data. I would have loved to see kind of where that came in. So this shows the total of units associated with those SB 35 approved projects. And what's interesting is just how many units these projects represented. About 14,000 units were streamlined using SB 35. And similar to the San Francisco story, 75% of those units were affordable. So this is working well for affordable housing projects. We've been having, an interesting discussion too about this with environmental justice groups, who have raised the concern, and I think it's valid, that, to the extent SB 35's ministerial approval eliminates environmental review, that could potentially leave residents of disadvantaged communities vulnerable to harmful impacts. I think Tiffany will probably speak to this later, but what we want to caution is while the prohibitions built into SB 35 prohibit its use in environmentally sensitive areas, I think it's really important to carefully monitor this. And if we need to make adjustments over time to prevent unintended impacts, especially for disadvantaged communities. Moving on, costs of CEQA compliance. So one of the criticisms of CEQA is that it costs money and time. But there's really not a lot of empirical evidence to assert that claim because it's really hard to study. And it's also very difficult to gather that data. So we have the privilege of working with one of the largest environmental review consulting firms in the state, PlaceWorks, and they know how much they get paid to do the environmental review, to write the EIRs and MNDs, and how much they pay their sub-consultants. And nowhere else is there really a central repository to gather this information. So what we did with PlaceWorks is we profiled a mix of projects doing case studies. We did 3 case studies for this report, 5 case studies for the 2016 report. And we really were trying to capture different uses, dispersed across different geographies across the state, capturing different environmental review processes as well. The first one, Redwood City, is a major mixed-use project. It contained about 520 residential units, 500,000 square feet of commercial. Environmental review was focused mostly at freeway congestion and ways to mitigate the impacts near this project. This was a full EIR. And the project cost was valued at $150 million. Environmental review was $700,000. And that translates into about 0.5% of project costs. Just as a reference, like architecture fees can range from 3 to 5% of development costs, and legal fees can be just as much. So this represents a small component of the total cost. The second case is a redevelopment of an obsolete food processing plant built in 1949. The developer proposed 600,000 square feet of flex space. Environmental review was also very inexpensive, only about 120,000, and this was an M&D. It also focused on traffic studies, and the reason why it was so limited was because this use was less intensive than the previous use. And finally, Vivante Senior Housing. So this is a senior housing project in Newport Beach that involved demolishing a former art museum. There had been an earlier proposal to build a 25-story residential tower. Different developer came forward with a senior housing project worth $60 million. The environmental review cost $90,000. This was handled as an addendum to a previously certified EIR. So I'm gonna now hand it over to Janet Smithheimer from the Housing Workshop, and she's gonna cover California prosperity and sustainability.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Janet Smithheimer of the Housing Workshop and former president of BAE. So I'm the same person leading both the 2016 report and this current expanded and updated report. So you've heard already this morning that among the common criticisms of CEQA is that the law affects California's economic prosperity and sustainability. So both the 2016 report and now the 2021 report took a look at some common metrics of measuring our prosperity and sustainability. And we'll talk about a few right now, and the report has many more metrics. Next slide, please. Looking first at the updated state employment growth, California is among the top 10. All of these metrics cover 2012 to 2019, did not include 2020, given that it was the pandemic and some of the data collection was lagging while we were writing this report last year. So you can see that California has the largest base of employment of any state, but we're not showing that metric on this slide. This is measuring just the rate of growth during that time period. And we rank number 7 among the 50 states of the US. Next slide, please. We also have an enormous GDP, the largest of any state in the United States, of course, and it's about a third more than the next largest state's GDP, which is Texas, which coincidentally does not have nearly the environmental review processes that we do. And you can see it's almost $3 trillion a year in California. The bottom graph shows the rate of growth, again, for the same time period. So starting from a huge base, we also grew quite robustly. We were the third most rapidly growing GDP during that time period. You'll see the other states, there are smaller states starting from a small base experiencing their own quick rates of growth. Next slide. Another metric is looking at median household income. California is a very wealthy state, as residents many measure as quite wealthy. We're number 1 during this time period in terms of the rate of growth. Also, as you can see on the graph, compared to the other, even faster than the other 10 states. Next slide, please. So the metrics I just covered were just some highlights of economic prosperity. If CEQA were seriously affecting this state's robust economy, you would see it in the data. We're not seeing it anywhere in the data. Switching gears slightly to sustainability, this is a more, oops, stay on that slide, thank you. This is a category of research that you can define sustainability in many ways. We include in the report a look at availability of parks, walkability scores, and other metrics. But I thought this one was the key highlight to show this morning, which is a study that's a little old after it was done in 2012, when the subsequent federal administration came in under Trump. EPA suffered a lot of halting of much of its work in this arena. Hopefully soon there'll be an update to this, but it shows a map of the US and the metrics of where there was the highest concentration of infill housing development compared to all development. You can see California measures quite strongly in that regard. And the findings of that study were that California and New York as states had the highest percentages of infill development compared to all housing development, one key metric of sustainable development. Next slide, please. Oops. Okay, so that was just a quick summary of some of the key highlights in the report. You'll find a lot of other stats in there about economic prosperity and sustainability. So I just wanted to kind of sum up what you've heard so far this morning, and we have several speakers to come, but sort of summarizing the data piece, which is the first part of our extensive report. Just some key points. As Jessica reviewed, CEQA is not litigated frequently. You heard about just an average of 195 lawsuits a year. And when you measure that against the estimated universe of CEQA review requiring documents, the lawsuits that were about document issues measured less than 2% of all of the estimated documents. CEQA is not a key factor in housing production. As we noted, the peak year in California was 1986, and you saw in that graph, subsequent cycles also rose to higher levels than the last cycle. So spanning 14 years since CEQA has been applied to private development, we are not seeing any signs just on that very basic metric that CEQA has kind of an impact on the cycles, given that we peaked multiple times after CEQA was in wide use on housing. We tried to take a look at streamlining both in the case studies and then also summarizing the HCD dashboard on utilization of SB 35 statewide. You saw some of those points. We think it's working and it will keep growing in its use, especially for affordable housing projects. Jessica and I do a lot of work for cities in partnership with affordable housing developers. And right now that's what we're seeing on the ground as well. Whenever it's available, it's generally in wide use, and it will continue. As Jessica noted, it's very hard to study the full cost of CEQA compliance, which I'll note more about in a moment, but we did provide case studies both in 2016 and 2021. And I should mention that we worked really hard to try to show you typical large project CEQA compliance. You didn't see any neg decks in those case studies or any quick environmental reviews. We tried to find projects that had extensive review and profile how those outcomes worked in a dispersed way, because many projects do not write full EIRs. They undergo other kinds of environmental review as appropriate. And finally, as I mentioned a minute ago, there's no evidence that we can find that CEQA affects California's economic prosperity or sustainable development, other than anecdotal stories told by others sometimes in the world. Next slide. Finally, just before we leave the stage, Jessica and I wanted to give you a taste of what we're hoping, having written a report like this twice now and worked through all the methodologies. We're hoping that in the future, there can be some additional research and data collection to try to continue to evaluate and refine the way CEQA is adapted in California on its development. One of the key issues that we see in our report writing is that we do need better data reporting. For example, we do have, through the law governing SB 35, there is a requirement for jurisdictions in their annual RENA reports to show how many units in their pipeline and how many projects are being reviewed under SB 35, but we don't have that same kind of data for any other sorts of even housing environmental compliance. So that's why we showed you case studies. We wish we knew a lot more about how a whole range of cities and counties are doing that review. That would be really instructive. And also, as Jessica mentioned, the cost of environmental review, which is a tricky topic full of anecdotes in the world, very little empirical evidence until you drill down with each project. And we wish there was a way that could be better tracked and reported. So we think in terms of future research, it will be really important to track and analyze the effectiveness of the various streamlining mechanisms that you're aware of, especially for the much needed market rate and affordable housing projects. And in a few years, we hope to be able to look back and see how they're working, especially in relation to any future additional changes and additional streamlining ideas. We think it's really important to understand if the suite of tools we have today is doing its job and is working well and balancing human development with conserving our natural world. And we also think it's really important, you're hearing bits of this, but it would be really important to take a moment and do some good research that quantifies both the direct benefits of CEQA, which Jessica and I believe at least are huge, creating direct benefits to the state. We're the only state that has the kind of environmental review that CEQA represents. We also have the strongest tourism, the most robust economic growth, the most dramatic greenhouse gas reduction, and more coming. All of these are direct benefits related directly to CEQA and how it's implemented. And then there are probably a lot of indirect benefits that could also be quantified. The nature of California offering strong quality of life to both its residents and businesses, leading to innovation and a whole host of reasons why demand is strong for housing. People want to live here, tied partly to environmental conservation. We think, for example, there are values in the views that are preserved from scenic areas, recreational facilities, probably have ripple effects through the health of the population. There's a whole host of indirect benefits that could be measured quantitatively in future research. And that ends our presentation, our portion of the presentation this morning. With that, we're going to turn it to Tiffany Eng, who is going to discuss CEQA and environmental injustice.
Hi,
Tiffany?
everyone. Hi. Thank you, Janet and Jessica. Let me try to share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see my slides. So let's see. Okay. So yeah, really happy to be here again today talking to some of you about CEQA. And for some of you who know our alliance, the California Environmental Justice Alliance, we have often mentioned that CEQA is a really important tool to advancing environmental justice and protecting the rights of the communities that we work with across the state. So again, for those of you who are new to CEHA, we are a statewide community-led alliance that works to achieve environmental justice by advancing policy solutions. Our members in CEHA come from across the state. You might know them as, for example, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Communities for a Better Environment, the Environmental Health Coalition, CCAJ, SCOPE, PSRLA, CAUSE, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, and a number of other organizations across the state. So what I want to talk about today is really the side of CEQA that doesn't get discussed very often, which is that our environment is oftentimes the things around us in our cities, in our communities, in addition to what's out there in the natural world. To begin, to get some clarity, environmental justice is something that we see as the basic right of people to live, work, go to school, play and pray in a healthy, accessible, and clean environment. And so when you think of this definition of the environment and of justice, we really see how this law allows low-income residents and impacted communities of color to protect their health, housing, and well-being in the environment. And for many people who know the issue of environmental justice, this is really an issue of both distributive justice, of making sure that we have both rights and protections for all communities, and an issue of procedural justice, which means that all people, regardless of their background, can have access to having a say in decision-making and laws. And so for the folks that we work with across the state, CEQA allows us to have notification of projects being proposed for our neighborhoods, allows us a really important process to share feedback and concerns about those projects, and gives people an opportunity or ways to recommend solutions to improve upon a project. And so when we think about the ways in which the EJ movement has developed, which really came out of both the civil rights movement and the environmental movement that's more mainstream, we have to think about these intersectional ways in which laws like CEQA can help protect communities and create the kind of growth and developments that everyone can benefit from. The Rose Foundation report goes through a number of case studies that talk about the impacts and benefits for environmental justice communities. And so I want to share a couple that we thought were like really, indicative of why CEQA is so important for EJ residents, which again are predominantly low-income residents and communities of color. So the first one that's mentioned is the Cagley Industrial Park, which was proposed for the city of Fresno back in 2018. And so in this situation, the city wanted to approve a permit for, or approved a permit rather, for a massive industrial park on 110 acres at the southern edge of the city of Fresno. For various reasons, the city decided that they were going to approve and prepare a mitigated negative declaration, or an MND, instead of the full EIR. This is really troubling for a number of reasons. Number one, the project of this warehouse would operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so the impacts around pollution, like air pollution, noise pollution, light pollution, and other health impacts would be operating nonstop on a constant basis. This includes things like, there was an estimated 6,260 vehicle trips that are, estimated for the local roads each day, which would be running by people's homes and neighborhoods. One thing that the project did not take into account was the fact that this proposal will be sited across from homes in unincorporated Fresno County. The first assessment really looked at just the homes within the city of Fresno and not the fact that it was across the street from unincorporated county area, which also included a local elementary school. The other injustice that is really facing this neighborhood is that it's a predominantly extremely low-income community and a Latinx community that has already been overburdened many times over by warehouses and other hazardous sites. This is one of the areas in the state that's ranked by Cal Enviroscreen as one of the most highly cumulatively impacted neighborhoods that experiences high cancer rates and other health problems like asthma and respiratory illnesses. So, the biggest issue moving forward was that, because the MND failed to adequately analyze or mitigate the project's significant impacts, the community had to intervene. So this group of neighborhood residents called South Central Neighborhoods United filed a suit, supported by groups like Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. And because it was such an egregious situation, the California Attorney General, Xavier Becerra, also intervened. So the result of this situation was that CEQA was actually able to help community residents protect their health needs and have more decision-making abilities in their neighborhood. And so because of this suit, the city rescinded its approval of the project, and basically in no defined ways that like the MND was insufficient. And they knew that if it were to move forward, it would not be legally defensible. Another example in the report that's being discussed is the issue of the petrolube oil and gas drilling operations for the city of Arvin that happened back in 2018. And so this is a situation where the city wanted to approve a conditional use permit to allow this oil company to drill 4 oil wells in the middle of a residential community. The city said that the project would not need to go through CEQA review because they could use a local exemption. Again, this was concerning for many different reasons, including the same reasons that were kind of shared before, of like these operations would be happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It would have and incur various forms of pollution, including light pollution and other kinds of health impacts. It would, of course, again, be right next to homes, schools, and elementary school, in city parks. And there'd also be other impacts, such as the fact that once the oil and gas was, discovered, it would have to be trucked or piped across the area and through the community, which could create very detrimental impacts to the community. So local residents organized through Community for a Better Arvin, alongside the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment, filed a legal challenge to this approval for this permit. And they show that through their legal challenge that the city did indeed violate CEQA by allowing it to have a Class 3 exemption, which was really meant for small facilities and structures like homes and stores and other things that have very minimal impact on the environment. So again, this is another example in which the city was forced to rescind approval of the project because it didn't comply with CEQA and it didn't fully analyze the impacts on the surrounding community that CEQA was allowed to discover. Another case study that was mentioned is around the World Logistics Center in the city of Moreno Valley back in 2015. And so again, another example in which the city wanted to approve a giant warehouse development amongst many other warehouse developments in this very low income, largely predominantly people of color community. And, you know, again, there's issues with truck impacts, the fact that if you do a massive amount of goods movement from the ports of LA and Long Beach to this community, oftentimes on very small roads, and that it really impacts air quality, which would impact local residents' health. And so both the public and local and state agencies warned that this EIR would not really do a good job in adequately mitigating many of the impacts that would happen related to health, air quality, noise, traffic, and climate. And through their advocacy, they were able to win a large settlement that allowed for $50 million in mitigation efforts and other benefits to the surrounding vulnerable communities. So as you can see through these case studies, CEQA really allowed people to have a voice, to be notified of these projects, and to either stop projects from entering their neighborhood that could really create an incredible amount of harm, or create benefits and mitigations to make sure these projects could be safely integrated into the surrounding neighborhood. And so a couple of things that we want to share as we move on from this discussion is that EJ groups really rely on CEQA to have a voice in creating safer communities. Without CEQA, there's very few ways in which people have a chance to be notified of projects and to have a say in how these projects get developed or whether or not they get approved. Really want to emphasize this point around CEQA being streamlined many times over the years. And it's exhausting to think about the ways in which CEQA is being streamlined for reasons that don't benefit public health and don't benefit local communities. And so instead of watering down CEQA, we really say that please, we want to work in partnership with the legislature, with decision makers to make sure that we can have good development, healthy and affordable housing, and that we don't have to choose between our health, our housing, and our environment. So just wanted to leave with my email in case people have more questions. And I want to direct people also to this environmental and housing justice platform that we created last year to address this issue of how do we have housing that's healthy, safe, and affordable for everybody. So feel free to check out the bit.ly address below. Thank you. I think next I can pass it on to Aruna, who can talk more about her experience working on CEQA.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm going to be talking about CEQA and climate change. Oh. Hold on, I'm sorry. Oh, give me 1 second. I apologize. Folks can see my screen now, I think. So let me switch to, okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to let me speak about CEQA and climate change. As Tim said, my name is Aruna Prabhala. I'm the Urban Wildlands Program Director and a Senior Attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity. The center focuses on protecting the diversity of wild animals and plants throughout the world, and in particularly in the United States and in California. And we do that by using a combination of science, law, and creative media. And in the Urban Wildlands program, we primarily focus on promoting sustainable development and smart land use policy that takes into account the needs of communities and wildlife. And of course, because I'm from the center, I'm obligated to take a couple pictures of critters throughout the presentation. Particularly, I've included ones that have really been impacted by climate change, including steelhead, western snowy plover, and desert kit fox. As many of you know, California is in the midst of a climate crisis, and we're feeling the impacts every day. Temperatures continue to rise, there's coastal flooding and erosion, increased frequency and intensity of wildfire, the snowpack is shrinking, and we're having water shortages, as you can see from this map that talks about the impacts of the drought, and our reservoirs losing more and more water. We're having worsening air quality, and our habitats are for wild animals are being degraded and losing ecosystem functions, which is why CEQA is such an important and helpful tool and helps us really address the climate crisis and the impacts that communities are feeling across the state. CEQA addresses climate change in a couple of specific ways. It requires public agencies to disclose and review projects' contribution to cumulative climate impacts. It makes them assess the significance of those impacts. And then most importantly, it allows for the identifying effective mitigation measures and ensuring those are implemented. The projects that are covered by the environmental review are often the biggest sources of climate emissions. So that ranges from individual, commercial, residential, and industrial development, as well as regional plan and local documents such as regional transportation plans, climate action plans, and infrastructure projects. I'm going to focus on a couple key cases that have came up in the report, as well as an additional new case that I think really highlight how CEQA has looked at climate change and how it has helped communities in the environment tackle this ongoing crisis. So first, I'm going to talk about the Cleveland National Forest Foundation, the San Diego Association of Governments case, also known as SANDAG. In 2011, SANDAG approved its 2050 Regional Transportation and Sustainable Community Strategy that laid out the plan for major transportation infrastructure for the next 40 years. The plan primarily focused on relieving car congestion through roadway expansions, rather than assessing and mitigating its greenhouse gas impacts, or putting San Diego on a pathway to reducing its transportation-related GHG emissions over time. This led to a divergence between the regional transportation plan and the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. The plan was ultimately challenged by the AG and community groups all the way to the California Supreme Court, which held in part that agency decisions on projects' environmental impacts, including climate change, must be based on scientific and factual data. But I think the most important impact of this case is the ripple effects it had on the ground. Namely that SANDAG, in part because of the litigation, updated its RTP in 2015 to take a more rigorous and realistic approach to its climate analysis and focus on transit-related growth. Other agencies in the state have soon followed, leading to better, smarter land use planning. The next case I want to talk about is the Center for Biological Diversity versus the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. That was a legal challenge to one of the largest residential projects in California, known as Newhall Ranch, which would bring 58,000 new residents to LA County. The Department of Fish and Wildlife found that although the project would result in 260,000 metric tons of GHG emissions per year, its climate impacts were not significant because it compared to a business as usual version of the project, where no climate-related requirements existed at the state or regional level. The proposed development would result in a 29% reduction in emissions. This meant that many GHG emission reduction technologies, such as rooftop solar, EV, charging stations, were not incorporated into this massive new development. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled against the project and found in part that the business as usual comparison was not supported by substantial evidence, and that individual new development projects could and should be more climate efficient. Following the Supreme Court ruling, a settlement was reached between the developer and the environmental groups, and the project is actually breaking ground right now. That settlement resulted in a new approach to the development known as Net Zero Newhall. It required 10,000 solar installations, 25,000 EV charging stations, retrofits of existing buildings in disadvantaged communities, zero emission school buses, and a whole host of new greenhouse gas mitigation measures that were not included in the original proposed design. This case also had a ripple effect throughout the state. It pushed developers and public agencies to do more project-level climate analysis and adopt more robust on-site mitigation measures to address projects' GHG emissions. so that California could continue to grow, but grow in a way that's climate efficient and supports climate resiliency. The last case I want to highlight is Golden Doors Properties versus County of San Diego. And this case dealt with ongoing challenges to San Diego County's climate action plan and its reliance on offsets to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions within the county. The appellate court found that in order to adequately mitigate for greenhouse gas emissions, the climate action plan need enforceable performance standards to ensure that the offsets used to mitigate the very real greenhouse gas emissions that were anticipated to come from new developments were real, verifiable, and additional. While this case covered a wide range of issues, I think the most important takeaway is that CEQA requires that agencies take the necessary steps to adequately mitigate climate impacts, often to the benefit of impacted communities, not rely on unverified and unreliable measures. And it requires this type of analysis and planning prior to project approval to make sure we're on the pathway to address our climate impacts and protect communities that are most impacted by them. So CEQA helps California tackle the climate crisis in a wide variety of ways. The data disclosure that is required through environmental review process is invaluable because it allows decision makers and communities to track how actions in their own backyards are contributing to or helping fight the climate crisis. It also allows for a cumulative level impact, meaning that we can take a bigger picture, a regional approach to understanding how our climate is changing and how individual projects are contributing to that process. It leads to smarter regional and local planning by pushing cities, counties, and agencies to take into account climate change when making planning decisions, and ensures that California can grow responsibly with careful consideration of the continuing climate crisis. It allows for accountability of our public agencies as well as private developers to ensure that everyone is doing their fair share to address greenhouse gas emissions. And we are using the technology that is available right now to build in climate resiliency and adaptation. And that's one of the reasons CEQA is such a powerful tool because it forces the developers to maximize opportunities to reduce and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't just require environmental analysis for the sake of generating paper. It requires agencies and developers to take action. And in California, because of CEQA, we have seen some of the most forward-looking, environmentally friendly, and climate resilient development. It's one of the reasons we see developments throughout the state include rooftop solar, reduce their reliance on natural gas, incorporate EV charging stations and other innovative technologies into their developments. And as we look forward, the climate crisis will undoubtedly present new challenges for Californians. We can anticipate more heat waves, more drought, increased sea level rise, and wildfire. And that CEQA will help us prepare for those challenges and adapt to them. And in particular, I want to take a look at the issue of wildfire more closely. It's something that's been brought up by several of the other panelists, but I want to highlight that climate change, as well as increased development in our WUI, is likely going to lead to more and more areas of the state being at risk for wildfire. But CEQA provides us a way to push back and to protect ourselves. The Attorney General and CBD have partnered to use CEQA to push developments in high wildfire zones to do more now to protect vulnerable communities from this growing danger, including requiring better evacuation routes and additional safety mitigation measures. We have worked together on challenging projects in Lake County in Northern California, as well as in San Diego, and are happy to see some of the changes being done by developers and cities to take this risk seriously. So in conclusion, I would just like to leave you with the message that protecting CEQA helps communities adapt to a rapidly changing climate. It helps us create resilient communities that can protect people and ecosystems. And right now, we should be working to strengthen CEQA, not weaken it, because we will all need CEQA in the face of a changing climate. And I always like to end with a critter, and that's a pika, one of the species that's been particularly impacted by climate change. And now I will turn it over to Sean.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about this important issue. I've worked with several of you on legislative staff before in past years, and it's great to have an opportunity to talk about this with you. The previous speakers have really covered most of the main points, both of the report and also a lot of context for why CEQA is important and the value that it has. So I'm just going to hit a few points that I think might help add a little bit of context to this. And just for context about my own experience, I've been working with CEQA over my whole 25-year career in a lot of different contexts. In terms of this report, I reviewed the report and made comments on a draft before it was published. And I certainly have my own thoughts about CEQA and the current policy and political environment. First, I guess I want to start by highlighting the primary differences between CEQA and other environmental laws. Of course, CEQA is a law that focuses on disclosure and the ability of the public to have information and participate in decision-making. Unlike our other environmental laws, it has no direct agency enforcement at all and does rely on community enforcement, which is a big distinction. It was a very innovative thing to do in the 1970s, and now it's that very aspect of it that makes it controversial. I think it's important to note that CEQA is really the only tool that we have in the law to address impacts together, including cumulative impacts. Our laws that govern air quality, water quality, and waste are not only based on standards that often don't reflect current science and current knowledge of risks, but also don't have the ability to look at impacts together. And so CEQA has value where our standards-based laws otherwise might fail. And I think this is apparent when looking at issues, especially like climate change and wildfires and other issues, which show that CEQA is adaptable to new challenges. I think it's important also to note that in the mid-2000s, CEQA was the first law that was used to require local governments to consider climate change in their planning. A lawsuit by, I believe, the Center for Biological Diversity and the State Attorney General's office against the County of San Bernardino really established the conditions that we now take for granted about local government planning issues to do efforts to do climate action planning. And while CEQA's role in that has changed over time, I think it's important to note that the reason that local governments were motivated in the first place to do that planning was because of CEQA. But I want to focus really on the environmental justice side of it that Tiffany discussed so well already. It's important really to emphasize that there really are not other tools to address environmental justice through the law. Our civil rights laws have demonstrated themselves to be inadequate. Our environmental laws don't provide tools to address environmental justice. And so it's not a surprise that CEQA and other environmental justice advocacy coalitions and organizations support it. This is also reflected in the relatively new California Attorney General's Environmental Justice Bureau, which was developed in order to use the authority of the Attorney General to improve environmental justice outcomes in California. And it turns out that the primary tool that they have is the use of CEQA, using CEQA in the Attorney General's independent capacity to do that. And again, this is because we don't have other laws that accomplish that. And I think it's important to note that this is the flip side of what people call abuse of CEQA in many other contexts. It is precisely the same tool that is used by communities subjected to decades of environmental justice that in a different context might be used in ways that some people think of as abusive or protecting interests that already have political power. And so when we consider how CEQA is used, we always have to consider both sides of it. We hear only one side of it typically, the idea that there are politically empowered communities that are using CEQA, but we don't hear as much about the fact that really over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen an ascendance of resources for environmental justice advocacy organizations to use CEQA effectively. And it's important in debates about CEQA to note that that's part of the equation, and that when we think about reforming or changing CEQA, we are changing it for, in ways that impact those groups and their advocacy at least as much as we're changing it in ways that affect the advocacy of others. And this, includes everything from siting of oil drilling infrastructure to the kinds of warehouse projects that we heard about already today. CEQA is the tool that environmental justice advocates use to address historical land use incompatibility and its legacy today. I'll note also that, and this is very consistent with the report, it seems that CEQA is often used as a way for local governments to not take responsibility for their own poor planning. And so CEQA is blamed for things that are not caused by CEQA. As was noted about the report, in the mid-1980s, we had hundreds of thousands of housing starts per year, and CEQA existed then, and more or less in the same form it does now. We've had up and down cycles since then. And if anything, CEQA has developed numerous exemptions since then. CEQA does not apply as stringently now as it did in that era. And on top of that, we see that the housing affordability and availability crisis that we face in California is mirrored in large cities in other states like New York City, as well as in smaller and medium-sized cities like Austin, Texas. So attacking CEQA just really misses the picture. It's a distraction from the housing issues and also ignores some of the equity issues that have been highlighted today. That isn't to say that there aren't ways in which CEQA also is used for things that I would not personally support and think might end up with bad policy. And we've been working over years to attempt to change CEQA in ways that will create less of those conditions while maintaining the parts of it that are important. I think the study today is well documented. It shows that there's a way to at least use some empirical data to show what CEQA has or hasn't accomplished. And I think it also highlights the way that other studies have kind of missed the point, relying, for example, on non-standard definitions of infill and assessing the impact of CEQA on cities. I think this report makes a really good contribution in that sense. So I'm going to leave it there because I know we don't have a lot of time left. I'm happy to talk about questions that folks have, but really just want to emphasize, in my view, that we see, in the public discourse increasingly only the idea that CEQA in some cases creates anomalous outcomes or adds expense without focusing on what we saw today, which is really the places where CEQA adds value for precisely the communities that have been disempowered in the political process. So I'm going to throw it back to Tim Little, who then I think is going to lead whatever time we have for question and answer.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you to all of our panelists. We have had some questions come in. Let me take the first one myself. Are the slides going to be available? Is the recording going to be available? Yes, definitely. We'll make that available to everyone and send it around, links and PDFs. We've had a couple of questions around what do CEQA review documents include? And again, I think I can take the first part of that answer before batting it on to the panel. When we've talked about CEQA review documents, it includes negative decks, mitigated negative decks, full EIRs. And there were some further questions around the idea of, do we have information? Can we break it down? The litigation rates, can they be broken down by the type of review document? And I guess I'd like to ask Jessica if she has a response she wants to share on that.
Sure, yeah, so Tim is right. CEQA review documents include neg decks, MNDs, and EIRs. And I thought I was going to be able to calculate this before this ended, but it turns out, so Appendix B of the report, which we should, make sure you have a link to, shows that methodology. And I thought that I had the lawsuits by review doc, so I could, compare numerator and denominator, but I think I don't have that in this report. And so I'm not going to be able to calculate it. for you live. But I agree. I think that's something that's really interesting. That would be interesting to see. I would suspect you would probably see a higher litigation rate for the more robustly reviewed documents. And that's hard, because it's a function of the numerator and the denominator, right? Like something like categorical exemptions, for which there are so many, you might have a very low litigation rate because, there may be fewer lawsuits related to categorical exemptions compared to really large denominator. For review documents that are more extensive, that have more significant impacts, like an M&D or an EIR, I would expect to see probably a higher litigation rate by product type. But then I think it's also then important to look at the quality of that lawsuit, right? Or what was the basis? What were the findings? Did they have to go back and revise the environmental review document? And so I think there's a bigger totality of things to consider in addition to that rate.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. We also have a question related to CEQA and greenhouse gas mitigation standards. And it's around the idea of any concerns about weak greenhouse gas mitigation standards in CEQA and the allowance of voluntary offsets with, as the question poses, without real standards or limits. And there's an example cited about the Warriors achieving carbon neutrality on the Chase Center by offsets from a Florida landfill project at a fairly low cost, a cost cited here of less than $40,000. And that was profiled as an environmental leadership project under AB 900. And there's I guess there's an opinion question about do our panelists think this should be or would be tightened up through case law or updates to the guidelines. I'm not certain who on the panel is best to address that. I see Aruna lighting up.
I can take that to start. It's an excellent question. I think the San Diego case that I mentioned, dealing with the climate action plan, does address a little bit of the issues around offsets. Offsets are certainly a growing CEQA greenhouse gas mitigation that, if done properly, particularly focused on local offsets, so it benefits the communities most impacted, I think can be a way to get funds to develop more climate resiliency. But they are also can be problematic by sending the GHG mitigation funds far away from the communities that are actually most impacted and the projects that are impacted. So I think there's been some positive case law pushing back against those kind of efforts, but certainly think it's one area where CEQA could be strengthened and should be strengthened to ensure that when we're looking at GHG mitigation, we're focusing on maximizing opportunities on site. So within the project footprint, all of the available ways to reduce the GHG emissions, and then focusing on how can we get mitigation funds to go to local communities, particularly those disadvantaged communities that are going to be impacted by these projects, and address some of the co-benefits that can come from more rooftop solar and EV charging. So I think it's a really good question, and I think an area where we can make some improvements. We'll wait for the courts to catch up a little too.
Thanks, Aruna. I think Sean may want to weigh in on this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, my first answer to questions like that is always that the best solution to those kinds of issues is state and local laws that actually address the question directly and impose requirements on new development. And we're starting to see that, and I think we need to see more of it. The other piece of my answer to the question is that I think that the Newhall settlement, for example, demonstrates that not only are developers not limited to what CEQA requires, but that in many cases, developers in the right set of conditions can be motivated to agree to do that, and that CEQA is one of the tools that can be used in order to get to that type of solution where you have more on-site, closer to net zero on-site, more local offsets. No outcome has been perfect in my view when you look at new development, but we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in these cases. And while I do think it would be valuable to have stronger CEQA requirements, I also think that the policy, in general, the policy environment around those issues is very strong in terms of state and local government beginning to impose more of those requirements anyway. And I think we're going to hit a tipping point where we see electrification, we see renewables, we see distributed solar, and we see provisions for electric vehicles, and we see that as a matter of course in new developments. And I do think that outcomes relating to CEQA, like the Newhall settlement, are part of why we're arriving at that point. But I don't see CEQA as the only tool to address that, in contrast, for example, to some environmental justice battles against industrial uses, incompatible land uses, where it is in some cases literally the only tool that can be used. So I see that distinction, but I do take the point of the question. I think it would be valuable to have more guidance for local governments from the state, whether that comes in the form of CEQA guidelines or other more substantive guidance about new developments.
Okay, thanks, Sean. And I don't see any further questions. I want to make some space because there have been a lot of activity in the chat, and I may not have caught up with all of it. Some questions came in that way. So I want to make space for a minute or two to just make sure that we've covered all the questions and responded to anything that came up. I want to thank the panelists for their presentations, and I want to thank our report authors, Janet and Jessica. I want to thank you all for attending and participating in the discussion today. I want to note that in the chat, there's a link to the report if you don't have it. Also that Aruna put in a number of resources, I think. And I think some of us know each other and some of us don't. I put my email into the chat, and a lot of times one of the things that flows out of a briefing like this is an identification of somebody you want to talk to and follow up. And I'm offering to facilitate any contact with any members of the panel. So if anybody has any follow-up, I've put my email in the chat, ping me, and I can get you in touch with any of the panelists. And with that, I think I'm going to say going, gone on the Q&A. I want to congratulate us all for bringing this one in on time, and thank everybody for being here today, and wish you all well. Thanks very much.